It was the year 1962, cloaked in the chill of the Cold War, when the United States government doubled down on its darker ventures, one of which was nestled deep within the confines of an unassuming building in Virginia. The facility, camouflaged by the guise of a mental health institution, harbored secrets so profound that even those working within its walls held only fragments of the truth. This was the realm of Project MKUltra, a name that whispered through the corridors like a ghostly wind. Dr. Adrian Hale, a psychiatrist of notable intellect and a simmering conscience, had joined the project 6 months ago, lured by the promise of advancing human understanding of the mind. The atmosphere was electric, thick with the promise of discovery and the palpable weight of moral ambiguity. Adrian was a man who wrestled with his ethics daily, his face perpetually shadowed by the gravity of his work. On a particularly overcast morning, a young nurse named Elena Carter walked through the security checkpoint for the first time. Her heart was a flurry of nerves and excitement, unaware of the true nature of her new place of employment. Bright-eyed and driven by a deep-seated curiosity, Elena was assigned to assist Dr. Hale, whose reputation as a brilliant but intensely private man preceded him. The first weeks blurred into a routine of clinical assessments and vague paperwork. However, the institution's air of secrecy began to seep into Elena's bones. She noticed how conversations halted as she approached, how files would snap shut and glances were exchanged. It was during her third week, while she was navigating the labyrinthine lower levels delivering medical supplies, that she stumbled upon the forbidden wing. A heavy steel door, far removed from the typical hospital wards, stood ajar. The dim light flickered like the heartbeat of the place, erratic and foreboding. Driven by an irrepressible urge, Elena peeked inside. What she saw was a scene that clawed at her very understanding of humanity. A man, strapped to a chair, his eyes blindfolded and body twitching, was surrounded by equipment that buzzed and blinked ominously. A figure cloaked in a lab coat monitored the instruments with clinical detachment. The sight sent a shiver racing down her spine, and as the door creaked slightly under her trembling hand, the figure turned, a mask of indifference masking their face. Elena's heart pounded like a drum in her chest as she hurried away, the image of the man's distressed state burning behind her eyelids. Over the following days, the scene haunted her. She watched Dr. Hale, noticing a certain heaviness in his steps that hadn't been there before. Their exchanges, initially formal and clipped, gradually warmed as Elena's earnest nature and sharp intellect won him over. One evening, as a storm raged outside, casting flickering shadows through the windows, their conversation unwittingly veered towards the ethical. "Sometimes the line between right and wrong is not just blurred, it's obliterated," Dr. Hale remarked, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes not meeting hers. Elena, her voice steady despite the churning inside her, responded, "But shouldn't we try to redraw it? For the sake of those who can't?" That night, their pact was silently made. A pact to peel back the layers of secrecy, to understand the full scope of the horrors that were being perpetrated under the guise of national security. The inciting incident had already taken root in Elena's mind, her curiosity now fused with a burgeoning sense of duty. As she lay in her modest quarters, the shadows of the rain-soaked trees danced across her ceiling, whispering of the storm that was yet to come. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with peril, but the truth beckoned with a fierce urgency that could not be ignored. As weeks melded into months, Elena Carter and Dr. Adrian Hale's clandestine investigation into the depths of Project MKUltra unveiled layers of secrecy more sinister than they had ever imagined. The facility was not just a laboratory for the study of the human mind. It was a crucible where souls were broken and remade. One late autumn evening, Dr. Hale escorted Elena through a maze of dimly lit hallways to a secluded archive room, under the pretense of reviewing patient histories. What they found were not just medical files, but a series of detailed reports documenting a series of horrific experiments aimed at mastering mind control. These documents revealed a chilling variety of methods: doses of LSD administered to unsuspecting subjects, sensory deprivation techniques that plunged individuals into the abyss of their own minds, and psychological torture designed to fracture psyches. Their reading was interrupted by the soft, yet distinct sound of footsteps approaching. Quickly, they concealed the documents and posed as if engaged in benign conversation. The door swung open, revealing Director Simmons, his gaze sharp and probing. "Working late, aren't we?" he asked, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of suspicion. "Just catching up on some patient files," Dr. Hale responded, his tone nonchalant. Simmons nodded, his eyes lingering on Elena before he departed as silently as he had arrived. Shaken by the close call, they decided to continue their investigation with even greater caution. Elena began to volunteer for night shifts, which allowed her access to areas that were less frequented during the day. One night, she discovered a wing that was completely isolated from the main patient areas. Inside, she witnessed experiments that chilled her to the bone. Subjects were placed in isolation tanks, submerged in water, deprived of all sensory input until their reality began to dissolve. The screams that occasionally echoed through the vents were testament to the torment they endured. Meanwhile, Dr. Hale focused on understanding the scientific rationale behind the experiments. He learned of a project codename Midnight Climax, where subjects were unknowingly dosed with LSD and observed through one-way mirrors. The goal was to see if a person could be manipulated to perform acts against their moral compass without their awareness. Amidst their investigation, they encountered Subject 16, a man who seemed to have retained his sanity despite numerous sessions under the influence of hallucinogens. Subject 16, known among the staff for his unsettling calmness and cryptic remarks, often shared glimpses of truth with those he deemed capable of understanding or enduring the harsh realities of Project MKUltra. During one of their brief, guarded exchanges in the dimly lit corridor of the facility, he shared with Elena a profound observation: "He who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens." His words pierced through the daily facade of routine medical treatments and psychological assessments, hinting at his deep-seated knowledge of the project's core intentions. As Elena pondered his words, trying to decipher the deeper meaning behind them, Subject 16 leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, adding a chilling detail to his already mysterious demeanor. "You haven't seen them. They are prisoners. They wanted to create a way to seize control of people's minds, and they realized it was a two-part process. First, you had to blast away the existing mind. Second, you had to find a way to insert a new mind into that resulting void." His revelation sent a shiver down Elena's spine. The idea of erasing a person's identity, their memories and sense of self, and then attempting to implant a new persona was horrifying. It transformed the already grim atmosphere of the facility into something far more sinister. An institution not just experimenting with mind control, but actively engaging in the destruction and reconstruction of human consciousness. This additional insight from Subject 16 provided Elena with a new lens through which to view the experiments she had unwittingly become a part of. It explained the severe psychological breakdowns she witnessed, the strange reprogramming sessions, and the subject's often robotic responses following certain treatments. The facility wasn't just a lab for testing drugs like LSD. It was an assembly line for manufacturing new, controllable human beings, stripping them of their autonomy and remolding them as tools for purposes unknown. Armed with this new understanding, Elena's resolve to expose the project deepened. She recognized that the stakes were higher than she had initially thought, not just for her personal safety, but for the essence of human freedom itself. This knowledge fueled her actions in the subsequent acts, driving her to take even greater risks to bring the truth to light. Late one evening, as the shadows lengthened and the corridors of the MKUltra facility grew quiet, Elena Carter found herself treading the lesser-frequented lower halls. Her shift had ended, but a forgotten personal item, a small, treasured photograph she kept in her locker, had drawn her back. Her footsteps echoed softly against the sterile, cold floors, the sound seemingly absorbed by the thick, oppressive air that filled the facility. Turning a corner, Elena nearly collided with a hastily moving gurney, pushed by two lab technicians. They were clad in nondescript gray scrubs, their faces grim and focused. The sight of them was not unusual, but the heavy, opaque plastic sheet draping over the shapes on the gurney was starkly out of place. The contours beneath were unmistakably human forms, Two bodies, side by side, unnaturally still. Startled, Elena stepped back, her heart thumping wildly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," she stammered, her words trailing off as her eyes fixed on the gurney. "Move along, nurse," one of the technicians interrupted, his voice terse, avoiding eye contact. There was a cold finality in his tone that chilled her further. As they maneuvered the gurney past her, Elena caught a glimpse of a hand dangling from the side, the skin pallid and lifeless. The sight sent a wave of nausea through her. Instinctively, her gaze followed the technicians as they continued down the hallway, turning into a room marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The door, usually closed and locked, was ajar tonight, and from her angle, Elena saw the room was starkly utilitarian with only a large industrial sink and several large metallic containers. Elena's mind raced. Deaths had to be reported, processed through formal channels. This secretive, hasty removal wasn't protocol. What had happened in the facility that required such secrecy? Were these victims of the experiments she had begun to uncover? The questions piled up, each more unsettling than the last. Compelled by a mix of fear and resolve, Elena edged closer to the room, her movements cautious. Peering inside, she saw the technicians lift the bodies with a clinical detachment, transferring them into one of the containers. The metallic clang of the container's lid closing echoed ominously in the empty corridor. Suddenly aware of her precarious position, Elena quickly retreated, her mind swirling with horror and disbelief. The image of the lifeless hand haunted her. Had it belonged to a patient she had cared for? A test subject she had seen walking these halls just days before? That night, as she lay in her bed in the small room provided for the nursing staff, the darkness seemed denser, more suffocating. Elena realized that what she had witnessed was not just a violation of medical ethics, but a sinister indication of how far the project was willing to go. The facility was not just altering minds, but disposing of those who perhaps knew too much, or had become too damaged to repair. The incident solidified her resolve. She couldn't turn a blind eye. She couldn't walk away. Elena knew she had to act, not just to expose the cruelty and the horror, but to ensure that those lost lives mattered. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but the weight of the secret she now carried made silence impossible. One evening, Dr. Hale managed to smuggle out a small cache of documents detailing the project's funding and intended goals. The most horrifying thing the documents revealed was that MKUltra was essentially a continuation of work that began in Japanese and Nazi concentration camps. Not only was it roughly based on those experiments, but the CIA had actually hired the vivisectionists and the torturers who had worked in Japan and in Nazi concentration camps to come and explain what they had found out so that the project could build on their research. Nazi doctors had conducted extensive experiments with mescaline at the Dachau concentration camp, and the CIA was very interested in figuring out whether mescaline could be the key to mind control. That was one of their big avenues of investigation. So they hired the Nazi doctors who had been involved in that project to advise them. The depth of the moral depravity shocked Dr. Hale. These documents painted a picture of a project that was not just ethically questionable, but deeply entrenched in some of the most atrocious human rights violations of the 20th century. The project's willingness to draw on the expertise of individuals who had conducted their experiments without regard for human life or suffering. Dr. Hale's hands trembled as he reviewed the files late into the night, the horrors described in the documents mingling with the sterile, humming quiet of his office. Every new detail added weight to his already heavy conscience. He needed to share this with Elena, not only because she had become his confidant in this clandestine endeavor, but because she had the moral clarity and courage that he felt he was sometimes lacking. The next day, he sought out Elena, his every movement tinged with urgency. Finding her in the cafeteria, he guided her to a secluded corner, ensuring no prying eyes or ears could intrude. "Elena, what we've uncovered so far barely scratches the surface," Dr. Hale began, his voice low and strained with the burden of his knowledge. "The documents I found last night reveal connections and origins they're unimaginable. The CIA has ties to Nazi and Japanese war criminals, the very people who conducted inhumane experiments during the war. They've been brought in as consultants to teach their methods." Elena's eyes widened in horror, her face paling as she absorbed the gravity of Dr. Hale's words. "That's monstrous," she whispered, her voice a mix of anger and fear. "We're dealing with something that goes beyond unethical. It's evil. We have to expose them, Adrian. We can't let this continue." Dr. Hale nodded, feeling a surge of grim determination. "I know. And I will bring everything we have to the authorities if I have to. But we need to get more evidence first. We need undeniable proof if we're going to take this down." Together, they plotted their next steps, the weight of their discovery binding them even more tightly together in their quest for justice. The information Dr. Hale had uncovered was not just a piece of the puzzle, it was a directive, a call to action that neither could ignore. Now more than ever, their mission was clear. They had to stop MKUltra, not only to save the current victims, but to honor the memory of all those who had suffered under similar experiments in the past. As Elena left the cafeteria, shocked, she felt an ominous presence behind her. Turning a corner, she came face to face with two stern-faced security officers. "We need to talk about your recent interest in restricted areas," one of them stated grimly, signaling the beginning of a more dangerous phase of their investigation. The corridors of the facility no longer felt merely oppressive. They were now a labyrinth that threatened to entrap them at every turn. As Elena faced the stern security officers, her mind raced with possible explanations that would not compromise her investigation or arouse further suspicion. She needed to maintain her cover as an innocent nurse, unaware of the darker undercurrents flowing through the facility. I got lost," Elena stammered, injecting a note of genuine confusion and fear into her voice. "I'm still not familiar with all the sections of this place, and the signs aren't always clear. I didn't realize I was entering a restricted area." Her eyes darted down to her shoes, and her hands fidgeted with the hem of her uniform, portraying a picture of anxious disorientation. One of the security officers scrutinized her closely, his eyes narrowing. "This facility has clear markings for restricted areas. It's hard to believe someone just wanders in. We'll need to report this incident." Feeling the walls closing in, Elena nodded quickly, her heart pounding. "Of course, I understand. It won't happen again. I can assure you, I had no intention of causing any trouble." Her voice was earnest, pleading for understanding. The officers, still suspicious but seeing no immediate threat from a seemingly nervous nurse, decided to escort her back to the main area. "Let this be a warning, Nurse Carter. Future incidents will lead to more severe consequences." Their tone was harsh, a clear signal that her movements would now be watched more closely. After they left her in the nursing station, Elena took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. The encounter had been too close for comfort, a clear indication that any further missteps could be disastrous. She realized that she needed to be even more cautious in her movements and inquiries. The corridors of the facility, once merely oppressive, now felt like a tightening labyrinth that could trap her at any turn. From that moment on, Elena adopted a more guarded approach. She reduced her nighttime wanderings, instead focusing on gathering information during her regular duties, always careful to maintain her guise of innocence. She started to use indirect methods to learn more, such as casually conversing with other staff and observing from a distance. Elena also strengthened her bond with Dr. Hale, relying on his higher clearance and deeper understanding of the facility's layout for guidance. Together, they mapped out a strategy to avoid suspicion while continuing to collect crucial evidence. They communicated in coded language, discussing their findings as if they were common medical cases. This careful dance of subterfuge allowed Elena to navigate the increasingly dangerous waters of the MKUltra facility. Each careful step, each coded conversation, and each guarded glance were part of her survival strategy, allowing her to continue her mission under the ever-watchful eyes of the project's security. Her resilience and adaptability in the face of such threats underscored her commitment to uncovering the truth, no matter the personal risk. That night, as she lay in her bed in the small, the darkness seemed denser, more suffocating. Elena realized that what she had witnessed was not just a violation of medical ethics, but a sinister indication of how far the project was willing to go. The facility was not just altering minds, but disposing of those who perhaps knew too much or had become too damaged to repair. The incident solidified her resolve. She couldn't turn a blind eye. She couldn't walk away. Elena knew she had to act, not just to expose the cruelty and the horror, but to ensure that those lost lives mattered. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but the weight of the secret she now carried made silence impossible. Their path forward was fraught with danger, but driven by a relentless pursuit of truth and justice. Elena and Dr. Hale pressed on, knowing that exposing the horrors of MKUltra might be the only way to stop them. The horror of their discoveries and the weight of what still lay hidden loomed large, a dark cloud over their every move. In the dank bowels of the facility, under the cloak of darkness, Elena stumbled upon a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her days. She had taken to exploring the lesser-known corridors during her night shifts, a flashlight her only companion in the otherwise oppressive darkness. On one such night, her light swept across a scene of pure terror in one of the experimentation rooms, Room 101. Room 101 was infamous among the staff who whispered its name with a blend of fear and dread. It was here that the most extreme experiments were conducted. As Elena peered through the small reinforced glass window in the door, her breath caught in her throat. Inside, a man was strapped to a table, electrodes attached to his temples pulsating with electrical currents, his body convulsed in sync with the rhythmic zapping sounds, his mouth open in a silent scream. The experimenter, a figure shrouded in a dark lab coat, methodically adjusted the voltage, oblivious to the human agony in front of them. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. She made notes of the room and the personnel involved, her hands trembling as she wrote. The experiments were not just breaches of ethical conduct. They were acts of barbarism, designed to break the human spirit under the guise of scientific advancement. The following day, Dr. Hale showed Elena a hidden room he had found, which contained recordings of the experiments. The films were even more horrifying than the documents had suggested. They showed subjects being forced into psychotic states, driven to the brink of insanity by drugs and psychological torture. In one film, a subject was exposed to a loop of disturbing images and sounds while under heavy sedation, a technique meant to implant subliminal messages. Amid this darkness, Subject 16 emerged as a beacon of cryptic wisdom. He seemed to have been through the worst of what Room 101 had to offer, yet retained a calm that was unnerving. During one of her unauthorized visits, Elena spoke with him, and he whispered, "The real horror isn't what they do to the body, but to the mind. They strip you of yourself." His words echoed in her mind as she and Dr. Hale prepared for the most dangerous part of their plan, extracting physical evidence from Room 101. They needed undeniable proof of the atrocities to bring everything to light. They decided to act during the facility's annual inspection, when the security would be slightly less focused on the internal staff movements. The day of the inspection, Elena's heart pounded as she and Dr. Hale navigated the corridors to Room 101. They were almost there when suddenly alarms blared through the facility. Director Simmons had been tipped off about a possible breach of security. The facility locked down, corridors sealed, and security personnel swarmed the area. Caught just outside Room 101, Elena and Dr. Hale were cornered. With quick thinking and a stroke of desperate courage, Elena created a diversion by triggering a fire alarm in another wing. The brief chaos that ensued allowed them to slip into the room. Inside, they quickly gathered all the recordings they could find, stuffing them into hidden compartments in their clothing. As they made their escape, the horrifying screams and pleas of subjects echoed through the halls, a grim reminder of the stakes at hand. The facility was a living nightmare, but they were determined to end its reign of terror. Their escape was narrow. Every shadow seemed to chase them, every sound a potential captor. Breathing heavily, hearts racing, they finally made it back to the safety of Dr. Hale's office. They had the evidence, but now they faced the monumental task of getting it out of the facility and into the right hands without being caught or worse. The weight of their mission pressed heavily upon them, the horrors they had witnessed cementing their resolve to bring down Project MKUltra, no matter the cost. The tension within the hidden walls of the MKUltra facility reached a palpable climax as Elena Carter and Dr. Adrian Hale prepared for their most daring move yet. Armed with damning evidence and heavy hearts, They plotted their escape and the exposure of the project's horrors. But the air was thick with suspicion, and every shadow seemed laced with danger. In the dead of night, under the guise of routine, Elena carried the evidence in a false-bottomed medical kit. Her nerves stretched taut as violin strings. Dr. Hale, with his access to the administrative wing, planned to create a diversion that would allow Elena to slip out unnoticed. Their plan was meticulous, but the weight of what they carried was not just physical. It was the burden of truth, heavy and harrowing. As the night wore on, Elena made her way toward the facility's rear exit, her steps muffled against the cold tile floors. Meanwhile, Dr. Hale accessed the facility's communication system to send a series of false alerts, drawing security to the opposite side of the building. The plan worked initially, with guards scrambling to contain the non-existent threats. However, Director Simmons, ever suspicious and astute, had been monitoring Dr. Hale and Elena more closely than they had anticipated. He intercepted Dr. Hale as he was leaving the control room, his presence like a cold shadow. "Going somewhere, Dr. Hale?" Simmons's voice was icy, his eyes piercing. "Or should I ask, what are you trying to let slip away?" Dr. Hale, caught and without immediate recourse, steeled himself. "This ends tonight, Simmons. You can't control everyone forever." Simmons merely smiled, a chilling expression devoid of warmth. "You underestimate the reach of this project, Adrian, but you won't be around to see its completion." Meanwhile, Elena reached the exit, her heart pounding in her chest. Just as she was about to step into the freedom of the night air, she heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching rapidly. Panic surged, but she pressed herself against the wall, hidden by the shadows. She watched as two guards, alerted by Simmons's call, sprinted past her hiding spot toward the administrative wing. Taking advantage of the moment, Elena slipped out, the cool night air hitting her face with the sweet taste of hopeful escape. She made her way to a pre-arranged meeting spot where a journalist sympathetic to their cause, whom Dr. Hale had contacted weeks earlier, awaited. Back inside, Dr. Hale was detained, facing the wrath of Director Simmons and the dark fate of those who crossed the project's agenda. His last hope lay in the success of Elena's escape. His sacrifice would be meaningless otherwise. The tension was palpable as Elena handed the stack of files over to the journalist under the dim light of a secluded street lamp. Her voice was hurried, her words spilling out with urgency. "These experiments, they're not just unethical, they're monstrous. People need to know what's happening behind these walls." The journalist glanced through the documents briefly, his expression unreadable. Then, setting the papers down beside him, he locked eyes with Elena. "These experiments are important for national security," he said in a measured tone. "This information doesn't belong to the public." Elena gasped, a cold shock running through her. "How can you say that? People are suffering. They need to be saved, not used like lab rats." Before she could grasp the situation fully, the sound of heavy engines rolled up the deserted street. Black cars, sleek and ominous, halted abruptly near them. Men in dark suits quickly stepped out, their movements precise and alarming. Elena's heart raced, panic seized her. As she turned to run, two men caught up to her, grabbing her firmly by the arms. They didn't speak a word as they escorted her to one of the cars, her struggles futile. The journalist watched the scene unfold, his expression stoic. As the car doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped away into the night, he picked up the documents, tucked them under his arm, and walked away into the darkness, leaving no trace of the exchange that had just occurred. In the aftermath of Elena's disappearance, the facility's operations continued with even tighter security. Rumors swirled among the staff about the nurse who vanished, but no one dared to speak openly. The project's overseers ensured that all traces of Elena's presence at the facility were erased. Her living quarters were cleared out, her records expunged, and her name became another ghost story in the halls of the secretive institution. Dr. Hale, who had remained confined during the ordeal, was released back into his duties under the heavy watch of Director Simmons. The warning was clear. Silence was his only sanctuary. Haunted by Elena's disappearance and his own inability to stop the unfolding events, Dr. Hale's work became his prison. Meanwhile, the media storm Elena hoped to ignite never materialized. The journalist she had trusted disposed of the documents, ensuring that the horrors of Project MKUltra remained hidden from public view. The story of what happened, the experiments, the ethical breaches, the personal sacrifices, dissolved into the shadows, unspoken and unseen. As years passed, the MKUltra project gradually wound down as international tensions shifted and new technologies emerged. However, the ultimate secrets of what transpired in the hidden rooms never saw the light of day. The few who knew the real truth either disappeared or were silenced, their lives forever altered by their involvement. For the outside world, Elena Carter simply disappeared without a trace. Rumors occasionally surfaced, speculating about her fate, but nothing concrete ever emerged. Inside the facility, her existence became nothing more than a whispered cautionary tale among the newer staff, a ghost story that chilled more than it enlightened. In the end, Project MKUltra remained exactly what it was designed to be, a shadow project in a world unwilling to confront its own darkness. The story of Elena, Dr. Hale, and the MKUltra project concluded not with revelations or justice, but with a haunting silence, echoing the chilling truth that some secrets are buried too deep, guarded too well, and are too unsettling to ever be exposed in full.